Hey everybody, welcome to this video on 5 Flask issues to avoid. I'm your host, Nafiul Islam, a developer advocate at Sonar. So I'm not going to waste too much time. Flask is a Python web framework that I'm sure everybody knows about, and we are going to dive right into 5 issues that I think a lot of people should avoid. The first one is that in a lot of projects, there's just no structure, and you should add structure because it allows you to grow your application in complexity. So here's an example of how you can add structure, which is to use the factory pattern to run your Flask app or to create your Flask app. One example of how to add structure is to use the factory pattern in your Flask application. So you use a create app method. And in this app method, you can of course add routes, but that's not what you really do. This is just an example. You can add routes, and what's more important is that you can add configuration to it. So here is an example of a configuration file. You can see that we have a base class of config that inherits from object, and we say that testing is equal to false. And later on in production config, we set the database URI. In development, we set a different database URI. We can say that testing is equal to true, whereas over here, testing is equal to false. So very typical Python classes can be used to configure your application, and you can have configuration in one place. It's also super easy to add that configuration. So here's an example. If config type is dev, we are going to go to app.config from object, and we can say that configs.development.config, which is in a separate file. So that's one way in which you can add structure to your application. There are more ways, such as adding blueprints. So here, for example, you can create your app and you can register blueprints, which are kind of like sub-applications within your Flask application. So when you're building out Flask applications, it's a good idea to follow this method so that you have some structure in your application, because oftentimes Flask applications can turn into very big one-file applications, and it's important to add structure early on. Now let's talk about something that isn't really particular to Flask, but I have seen a lot of in Flask applications, which is that there is no password hasher, or rather there is no password hashing to make sure that your passwords are secure. And in order to do this, you can add it quite easily. You can install Flask bcrypt, and you can add bcrypt to your Flask application. And once you have, you can just use Flask decrypt to generate your hash password, and you can also use it to check password. Okay, so we're at number 3, and this is something that's not particular to Flask, but there are a lot of people that use raw SQL in Flask queries. Now, I can understand using a raw SQL query or something of that nature to quickly test out a prototype application, but it's probably not a good idea because you are vulnerable to SQL injections. Here's an example. You get your username from your requests, it's not sanitized, you get this information into your database, and now the hacker can basically inject any kind of SQL into the database, which isn't good. So make sure to use something like an ORM or a lightweight library that abstracts over your SQL connection. Okay, this one is very particular to Flask, and that is not using Flask extensions. Here's an example of Flask login, which is one of its most used extensions, which allows you to basically have requirements on accessing routes. For example, here on logout, login is required. On a protected route, login is required. So please use these extensions from Flask to better enhance the way that your applications are written. And lastly, this is something that I see a lot in a lot of code bases, which is that there is no error handling. What often happens is that errors are just handled on the route itself using if-else statements, and oftentimes you don't really need to. You can instead designate error handlers to make sure that you get the right error handling for each particular error code. So here you have a 404 handler, which is a not found, and then you have a 500 handler, which is an internal error. This allows you to have a lot more control over the way your information is presented to your users, and it also allows you to have a lot more control over how your errors are handled internally. So that's all, folks. Those are 5 quick ways in which you can rapidly and quite radically improve your Flask applications. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you again in the next one.